Great. Thank you. Good morning. Thanks for sticking around to the second panel today. My name is Adam Smith. I'm a senior fellow here at the International Peace Institute. I first want to say thanks to our partners in this seminar, Norway and Austria. It's been a pleasure to organize this with you. Our second panel, we will be talking about practices to meet and address the emerging challenges of protecting civilians in peace operations. I want to get straight to our panelists because I think they have a lot of interesting things to say and because I want to give us some time for question and answer, and I know we're a little bit behind the time already. What we'll do is we'll start from my very far right and move our way over. Our first speaker is Walter Lotze, who's a civilian advisor in the Peace Support Operations Division of the African Union. He's currently on secondment to the AU mission in Somalia. He's also worked at a number of think tanks, NUPI, Accord, ZIF, you name it. Walter is a good friend to IPI, and he'll be talking a bit about the AU's perspective and some of the challenges they face in protection of civilians. Please, Walter.
Thanks, Adam, for that warm welcome. And thank you also, of course, first of all, to the missions of Norway and Austria, as well as IPI, for inviting the African Union Commission to come and participate in this panel. This is a subject that has been very important to us for a number of years, and so it's always wonderful to come and share some of those reflections as well. I'm actually going to abuse Adam's good nature, and I'm going to do a little bit of both. I'm going to present both from across the first and the second topics, if that's all right with you. Just to reflect a little bit on where we are as an organization from a policy point of view. Where does protection of civilians sit with regards to peace support operations today? And then to go a little bit more into the operational side of it and say, why is it so challenging as well? As has been alluded to this morning already, over the last 4 years specifically in the AU, a lot of progress has been made with regards to protection of civilians in peace support operations. As was mentioned, I think, this morning in the introduction, in the Constitutive Act of the African Union, which takes us back to the early 2000s, protection of civilians was embedded very much in that founding document. And in the subsequent policy work that was done to create the African peace and security architecture, and specifically the standby force, protection of civilians is embedded everywhere very inherently in the founding documents and the policy articulations of the time. The problem really was that we left it at that. 10 years ago, we created the AU. We said we'll have a standby force. We said we'll do peace support operations, and protection of civilians matters. And we never really got around to articulating the guidance, the policy guidance, the operational guidance, the training directives, all these things that David mentioned this morning that DPKO has been working on for so many years now. That work only started, in all honesty, about 3 or 4 years ago in the AU context, where we dusted off the policy aspirations of a decade ago and said, now what do we do with this? The reason we did that was because we started deploying peace support operations long before we were ready to do so. The vision was that the AU would be given about 5 or 10 years to build up the capabilities to deploy these kinds of operations, and then we would have everything in place to deploy them. The reality is that the AU deployed its first peace support operation before the Peace and Security Council held its first session. So we did everything a little bit circular. And the first mission to be deployed, of course, was to Burundi, AMIB 2003. We had no POC language in the mandate at all, and POC wasn't really embedded in the planning for the operation. So what had to be done there was we had some very creative force commanders and senior officials on the ground who started to bend the rules of engagement as far as possible at the time to start to reflect and articulate the mission's role with regards to protection of civilians. But it was not a protection of civilians mission. It wasn't in the mandate. It's not what we were doing at the time. The next big mission to be deployed was then AMIS, of course, 1 year later to Darfur. And it was discussed this morning as well. AMIS had protection of civilians in its mandate, but we didn't have the operational planning and the capabilities in the operation to back that up. So we were doing a lot of learning by doing on the ground. Some very good practice emerged from that, and that's what really has informed our policy development since. But we didn't do a good job at capturing it. We didn't do a good job at feeding that back into the policy and decision-making cycle. So a bit of learning by doing. The next big mission to be deployed then was AMISOM 2007, which we still have in theater today. Again, protection of civilians was not explicitly a part of the mandate. It wasn't explicitly a part of the language. But given how the security situation in Somalia unfolded through the life of the mission and as it continues to do today, it was clear to us that we had to do something, that it was very, very important to make sure that we were doing something on protection of civilians, that we weren't just ignoring it. And all of that had to happen at the operational level while trying to develop a protection of civilians agenda overall as an organization. And so we had these two parallel tracks. What's happened in the last 2 years at the policy level? A lot. The Peace and Security Council held its first open sessions, thematic sessions, on protection of civilians in 2011, and that now happens on an annual basis. You'll see that every year the Peace and Security Council does have a thematic session on protection of civilians. We have a lot of protection of civilians language in the reports of the chairperson to the Council and to the UN Security Council as and where required, where we report now as a standing obligation on protection of civilians situation in the area of operations and what our missions are doing to address any risks, threats, and vulnerabilities. We've also put in place planning guidance. Some of it is finalized, some of it is still draft. It's still an ongoing process. But we now do have draft guidelines on protection of civilians in our operations. We have a planning matrix that is in place. We've also been working on an aide-memoire for decision-making to assist members of the Peace and Security Council when it comes to creating that protection of civilians mandate. What sort of language has been used in the past? What are the operational implications? What are the resource implications? What are the different options that are available given any type of situation? And we find that that has been taken up very well. So overall, we had a lot of progress in a very short space of time at the policy level. And that led in 2012 the Peace and Security Council to take what for us is quite a landmark decision. The Council decided that all future AU peace support operations must have protection of civilians as part of their mandate. That was 2 years ago already. So from very ad hoc approach, some missions had it, other missions didn't. For the last 2 years, we've had a standing decision that all our missions will have protection of civilians considerations as part of the planning process, as part of the mandate, and as part of what we do in the field. And you can see that the last two major missions that have been deployed, AFISMA to Mali and MISCA to the Central African Republic, you'll see that protection of civilians is not only in the mandate and in the planning, it is very much at the heart of what those operations were asked to do. And these mandates have been endorsed and reinforced by the UN Security Council as well. So we've had a lot of movement in a very short space of time at the strategic level, at the policy level. What's interesting also, if you look at some of those decisions, is that on the one hand, we're very close to what the UN did and continues to do. We actually borrowed or stole, depending, the UN's tiered approach to protection of civilians in peace support operations. We still have a 4-tiered approach. The UN moved to a 3-tiered approach, but it's very much the same type of thinking about how to approach the implementation of these mandates in the field. What's also different, though, is that we look at it from 3 distinct perspectives and then see how we can make that operational on the ground. The one is that we factor protection considerations into the conduct of the operations, which is very much an IHL type of approach to say, well, when we conduct operations, how do we make sure that we meet our IHL obligations and that we factor these into the way in which we do our work? The second is that our mandates currently have a very strong phrasing on the obligation of the mission to provide support to the state authorities to meet their obligations to protect the civilian population. So AU operations generally are very much in a supporting role to assist the extension of state authority, to assist the security actors of the state to ensure that the civilian population is protected. The third layer that we then look at is protection of the civilian population in our area of operations or responsibility, to say that when everything else goes wrong, what do we do as a mission to make sure that the civilian population is protected? So we've added another 3 layers of complexity to planning, which makes us very popular. So while all of this has been going on at the policy level, at the level of the Commission and the engagement with the member states, and you're seeing a lot of reaction now from the Peace and Security Council on these kinds of issues, pronouncing itself very strongly on protection of civilians in conflict zones, the challenge really has been, or now shifts to the operational side of it. How do you take all of this? How do you take this will, as General Kamer reminded us just before the break? The will is really important. And from our perspective, our member states are displaying that they have the will. to do this, but how do you make that happen on the ground? And particularly, how do you do that in the kinds of deployment contexts in which the AU is now operating? Somalia, Mali, Central African Republic. These are very, very complex situations, and if anybody in the UN tells you that their peacekeeping missions are under-resourced, we'll invite you to come and have a conversation with the AU. We'll tell you the same thing. We're even more under-resourced than UN operations, we'd argue. So how do you do even more in an even more complex setting with even less capability? And that's the challenge that we're facing right now. And that's where I would turn to the case of AMISOM, as that is the mission that we've been running the longest, for 7 years now, and where we've had the most practical experience on protection of civilians and some of the issues that have come up for discussion. In AMISOM, we have a bit of a tricky situation because it's the one AU mission that currently operates that does not have protection of civilians language explicitly in its mandate. But the AU Commission has been requested both by the Peace and Security Council of the AU and by the UN Security Council to mainstream protection considerations into the mission's operations. Now that's wording that can let you do quite a lot, or that can tie your hands, depending on how you want to look at it. But we've taken the approach that enables us to do quite a lot, because we can look at our operations, look at every facet of them, and then see, well, how can we make sure that when we do this or we do that, we take protection of civilians into consideration and do our utmost to ensure that no civilian harm is caused as a result. I'll run you through 9 things that we have done with that language and that we think is pretty good. The first is that we had a comprehensive revision of the rules of engagement. That was done already 2 years ago, but it's an exercise that is actually done now on an annual basis. As the pace of operations evolves, we on an annual basis now review the rules of engagement for AMISOM. And we strike a delicate balancing act because we have to, on the one hand, make sure that they are flexible enough to ensure that we can achieve the mandate, which is quite broad and quite robust. On the other hand, we have to make sure that they always at all times are in line with IHL and with the mission's protection strategy. And so there's a constant adjustment that has to be done, and that changes. It's a perspective that we bring to the table. It's a discussion that we have in the mission and between the mission and the headquarters. It's not perfect, but it's a very useful tool to make sure that we're conscious of what we do. The second thing is that an indirect fire policy was developed for AMISOM. This was quite a unique development, brought about simply by the operating environment that the mission found itself in. But there was use of indirect fire. It was in line, of course, with IHL obligations, but we didn't necessarily have all the systems and procedures at the back end of the house to make sure that we had the documentation, that we had everything lined up to say, well, when the indirect fire was used, these were the circumstances, this is what happened, these are the lessons that we draw from it. So the back end of it was not as tight as we might have liked it. And a lot of work went into that. We had assistance from an organization that was mentioned this morning, Civic. They put quite a lot of work into this with us, and it was a very useful partnership because we got a very robust indirect fire policy for AMISOM, and the results, I think, speak for themselves. We've been very pleased with what that has achieved in the mission area. The third thing that we've initiated is a civilian casualty tracking cell. That's something that also has been requested by the UN Security Council, and it's something that we've been putting work into. I can say at this point in time, it's much easier on paper than it has been to actually make operational in reality. It comes with a number of complexities on the operational side, and because it sets precedent for us, it's not something that we see as a once-off, but it's something that we see as being possibly quite a useful tool for other operations when it comes to civilian harm mitigation. We've put a lot of work into making sure that it's done right in AMISOM so that it can be done right and replicated in other missions, should we so choose. The fourth thing we did is, on top of all of that, is to develop a mission-wide POC strategy to say that we're not only looking at meeting our IHL obligations, we're not only looking at civilian harm mitigation in the conduct of complex operations, we're looking at protection of civilians more broadly in the way in which AMISOM as a multidimensional mission conducts its work. And that talks about, as David mentioned this morning very importantly, not just the military component, but what your police and your civilian capabilities can bring to the table as well. And it's about fostering that discussion in the mission on a daily basis, in your planning, in your lessons learned, in your reviews, making sure that the whole mission is coming together with all the available assets to promote protection of civilians. We've done a lot of IHL training as well, together with our troop contributing countries, but also in support of the Somali security actors, particularly the Somali National Army, because we are conducting joint operations with them as we expand further into south central Somalia. And so it's very important for us that we've gone into a training partnership with them, that we have the same view, the same understanding, the same approach to operations. We have also been working on developing a protection, human rights, and gender section on the substantive side of the House. We were very proud of this. It was going to be the first mission in the AU that ever had a protection, human rights, and gender section. Then Mali came. Mali was the first mission. Then we thought AMISOM will be the second. Then we had MISCA. So now AMISOM will be the third mission that has a protection, human rights, and gender section. But the important thing to note, I think, is that this is now becoming standard in AU peace support operations. From not having had this 2 years ago, all of our operations will have had it or have it by the end of this year. The eighth thing that we've done, it's a long list, is that we've put a lot of focus on our police capabilities as well, is that we're moving away from looking at this as a military-centric type of operation and that what we do to protect civilians comes from the military arm of our operations, but to say that there are other things that we can do. And the focus to date has been putting formed police units into Mogadishu specifically and putting individual police officers in a training and partnership role wherever we can, security permitting. And the formed police units specifically have yielded a lot of positive results in Mogadishu because it's allowed us to support the Somali National Police in a partnership on public policing, rule of law, law and order in the streets to bring the police capability to bear. And that's a long-term strategy that should outlive AMISOM as well. It's not something that will only be done through our policing capabilities, but that we can work to assist the Somalis to do in future as well. The last thing then, which is quite a complex discussion on its own, but it's worth mentioning, is that we're currently investing in building up a human rights due diligence policy capacity in AMISOM. As you'll be aware, the HRDDP is something that features now prominently in Security Council resolutions, and it's something that that applies to AMISOM operations, particularly because we conduct joint operations with the Somali National Army as well. It's something new to us. Let me say that quite openly. It's something that we're still getting our head around, but we're trying to bring in expertise and trying to build systems, not just in-house, but partnering with the UN and with the Somali authorities as well, to build a joint understanding of what it means, what the implications are, and how we make sure that we meet our obligations in a joint manner accordingly. That's what we've been doing for the last 2 or 3 years. Some have obviously progressed further than others. But I'd also like to highlight that one of the real challenges that we're now seeing is that all of these measures that we've taken were taken because of the situation that we found ourselves in operationally in the last 2 or 3 years. The challenge that we now face is that the situation is evolving, and we may not be perfectly positioned to catch up with that evolving situation as quickly as we want to. Some of it is positive and some of it is less positive. But there are 3 observations I'd like to make as a concluding thought. Thank you. The first one is to say that all of the investment that went into things like civilian casualty tracking and indirect fire policy, those were reflective of the nature of the AMISOM operations that we saw a few years ago. But I do want to highlight that since the end of the operations in Mogadishu, which is now 2 years ago, we haven't actually been conducting those kind of operations anymore. We've been expanding into south central Somalia. We are doing a lot of securing of supply routes and putting small detachments into urban centers, but it's not the kind of security operation that we saw. So the systems and procedures we've built up are very good, but they don't necessarily fully reflect the way in which the operations have evolved to date. And we have to see whether they meet those requirements or whether we now need other things to meet our current operational reality. The second observation is that Al-Shabaab has also rapidly adapted its tactics and its techniques and is now pursuing a strategy of asymmetrical engagement. The problem there is that there is now a lot of direct targeting of the civilian population. And we've seen this increase, unfortunately, in the last 2 years. The use of improvised explosive devices, grenade attacks, targeted assassinations, attacks on civilian targets, erecting of checkpoints, you name it, it's happening. And we don't necessarily have the statistics and the numbers to back this up because our casualty tracking system is still being developed. But what has become clear is that the number of civilian casualties as a result of Al-Shabaab activities has risen sharply in the last 2 years. And we're not fully prepared for that. And the Somali authorities are not fully prepared for that. So how do you protect the civilian population in that kind of context where they are becoming the direct target? And you don't have the capabilities. We don't have 150,000 personnel that we can spread across south-central Somalia. We don't have aviation assets. What do you do in that kind of context? And we're looking for the answer to that. The third challenge also related to that is that the kinds of operations that we're conducting require a lot of other actors to come in to ensure that the civilian population is protected. But there is still something to be improved on with regards to coordination and the joint approach that we bring to the table. AMISOM is one actor, and we can do certain things within our power, but we are, of course, supporting the Somali federal government. And there are other actors. There is the UN in a political role. There is the humanitarian community. There are international development actors. And jointly, it should be our approach, our obligation, to understand the risks, threats, vulnerabilities, and to understand what we can bring to the table. But I think we can improve on that still, understanding how we can jointly work together to protect the civilian population. Right now, we have a context in south-central Somalia where, as a result of the expansion operations undertaken by the federal government with the support of AMISOM, there's a lot more territory that's under the control of the federal government. Al-Shabaab no longer stands and fights for that territory, they withdraw. But they do a number of things when they withdraw. The one is that they deliberately destroy the wells and the water sources, either by blowing them up, blowing up the pumps, or throwing rocks in them. So all the water sources are being destroyed, and we're now entering the end of the rainy season and the beginning of the dry season. The second thing that's happening is that Al-Shabaab displaces the civilian population from these urban centers into the countryside. The third thing that happens is that then food delivery, commercial or aid is being blocked into these areas. So we have a situation that we can only address through joint planning, joint approaches, and leveraging everything that everybody has and that they can bring to the table at a certain point in time. But there's still a lot to be done on coordination mechanisms and understanding that it's a joint approach and a joint responsibility to achieve the kinds of results that we want. So those are my 3 concluding thoughts, and thank you, Adam.
Great. Thank you, Walter. I think you probably spent the trip over from Mogadishu thinking of an appropriate transition to our next speaker about coordination mechanisms. I appreciate that. And gave us a lot to think about in terms of AU and the changing operational challenges in the field. Our next speaker is Greg Puley, who is Chief of OCHA's Policy, Advice, and Planning Section. Greg previously worked for Oxfam, a number of different capacities, head of the New York office. He has seen action in the field pretty much anywhere you can think: Gaza, Uganda, DRC, Mali, Zimbabwe, Central America. So tremendous field experience and also policy expertise. We look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thanks, Greg.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Adam, and thanks also to Norway and Austria and to IPI for hosting this very timely and useful event. I'd like to start before I launch into the presentation by just saying a few words about why this topic is so important for OCHA and why it's so important for humanitarian actors more broadly. That is, the relationship between humanitarian actors and peacekeepers, or those military and other actors that are engaged in peace support operations. The first one is kind of an obvious one, but I think it bears repeating. It's just the simple geography of it. If you look at the places with the most acute humanitarian need, those places where humanitarian actors are facing the most difficult challenges, both in terms of their scale and in terms of their complexity, with a few important exceptions, Syria obviously being one, and the region right now. These are places where humanitarian actors are working alongside peacekeepers or other mandated peace support military actors. If we are to be effective in these environments, we need to find ways and continue to build upon ways that we've established to work together. It's just a simple fact of the way the humanitarian need is spread across the world. A second is an operational imperative. There is a complex operational interplay between humanitarian actors and military actors in these environments. We come from distinct entry points. In some cases, it is important for us to maintain distinct identities. We have sets of principles that in some cases overlap and in some places are distinct. But if you look just at the way PKOs are mandated now by the Security Council, in all of the cases where the basic protection of civilians language exists in the PKO's mandate, the mission is also mandated to create the security conditions conducive to the provision of humanitarian assistance. Not, I hasten to add, to provide assistance, not to directly provide security for humanitarian actors, but to create the security conditions conducive to the provision of humanitarian assistance. This means we must work together in order to ensure that that mandate is fulfilled to the greatest benefit of people in need of that assistance. And the third point, the third reason that this is so important for humanitarian actors is just the point of principle. Protecting people from harm is a core part of humanitarian action. It is part of the DNA of humanitarian actors. That is, humanitarian action is not only aimed at providing for people's basic needs, food, water, shelter, et cetera, but also doing everything we can to ensure that people are protected from harm and that their rights are upheld and protected. So it's not a coincidence and it's not an accident that it is a kind of partnership between humanitarian actors and our friends and colleagues in peacekeeping operations that was really part of the catalyst of bringing the international community to focus much more squarely on the role of peacekeepers in protecting civilians. And David mentioned earlier the collaboration between DPKO and OCHA through the 2009 study, which was really a landmark look at how protection mandates are fulfilled by peacekeeping operations. We continue to work together across in a range of areas in providing briefings to the Security Council's experts group on the protection of civilians, in configuring and disseminating the guidance that's been mentioned both for peacekeepers and for humanitarian actors on how to work together in the field. Of course, it's not always easy. Of course, there are distinct entry points and different principles, but for these practical and principled reasons, we must continue to find ways to work together, and we're going to need to continue to do that because particularly in some of them, we are facing a number of complex challenges that are going to require a sophisticated and nuanced interplay between humanitarian actors and peacekeepers. So as we heard a little bit this morning, the landscape in which peacekeeping operations are deployed is changing, and there have been a number of important developments in the mandates of UN peacekeeping operations in the last few years. I'm going to touch on a few of the risks that are inherent in some of these changes and some of the complex and insecure environments in which we must work together, and then on some of the measures that we can take together to mitigate those risks. Security Council Resolution 2098, for example, with regard to the DRC, marked a shift with the explicit inclusion of a peace enforcement dimension, and David mentioned this earlier, that is the Force Intervention Brigade, within the overall peacekeeping mandate of MINUSCO. Security Council Resolution 2100 on MINUSMA also contained language enabling the mission to take robust action and saw the mission deployed to a new type of environment for UN peacekeeping, that is alongside a counterterrorism operation with the potential for asymmetric threats. Security Council Resolution 2149 authorized the deployment of MINUSCA, which also has a protection of civilians mandate into a situation of grave insecurity where the institutions of the state had largely eroded. The risks inherent in these contexts and in these operations need to be recognized and managed, in the first instance by the Security Council itself, but also at the field level through clearly defined roles and responsibilities and coordination mechanisms within missions and between missions and humanitarian actors. The first and most obvious of these risks is the potential for harm to civilians in the conduct of operations or in the support of national forces conducting operations. We heard quite a bit about this morning. Operations by the Force Intervention Brigade, for example, while aimed at neutralizing armed groups and the threat they pose to civilians, could themselves result in harm to civilians or civilian objects. We discussed this morning, I think we're going to hear a little bit later about the measures that can be put in place to mitigate these risks. That is an objective that is very important to humanitarian actors. A second risk is that where forces are engaged in such operations, they may become or be seen to be a party to the conflict. Thus, the impartiality of the mission may also be questioned. So an affiliation with parties to the conflict or the perception of such an affiliation can increase the risk of the mission itself being targeted. The degree to which this impacts on the ability of missions to effectively protect civilians is not entirely clear, but this is something that must be on our collective radar. For example, certain tactics used in the protection of civilians, such as close engagement with communities or proactive military patrolling, may need to be revisited in situations where missions themselves are under threat, i.e. their presence could provide an additional risk to the civilians they are there to protect. Previous operations against armed groups in the DRC have highlighted a third risk. That is that civilians are not only vulnerable during hostilities, but in the aftermath of hostilities. For example, where the FARDC or MONUSCO has not been able to hold territory after operations against armed groups, this has in some cases resulted in retaliation against communities for perceived allegiances, both by the FARDC and by armed groups upon retaking territory, resulting in increased instability and threats to civilians. The ability to hold territory and deploy civilian administration and police in areas cleared of armed groups is thus crucial to avoiding retaliation against civilians. And finally, where missions are perceived as a party to conflict, there is a risk that humanitarian actors working alongside the mission will not be perceived as operating according to the humanitarian principles of neutrality, impartiality, and operational independence. While the humanitarian community is diverse, it is united behind these principles. And our concern is not about the principles for their own sake. Rather, respect for the principles is key to gaining acceptance within and access to communities, and thus for our ability to provide assistance to people in need. Let me turn to a few of the ways in which humanitarian actors and others can work together to mitigate some of these risks. And the first has to do with working within multilateral mechanisms to advance norms, standards, and practice to improve the conduct of hostilities by all parties to conflict. And in this regard, I would draw your attention to the challenges posed by the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Since 2009, the Secretary General has highlighted the use of explosive weapons in populated areas as a major challenge to the protection of civilians. This has been echoed by many member states, including notably in the open debates on the protection of civilians, and there has been a growing recognition in recent years of the humanitarian impact of the use of these weapons. Many types of explosive weapons exist and are currently in use. While different technical features dictate their precision and explosive effect, these weapons generally create a zone of blast and fragmentation, which makes their use deeply problematic in populated areas. According to research by Action on Armed Violence in 2013, 37,800 people were reported killed and injured by such weapons, of which 82% were civilians. When explosive weapons were used in populated areas, 93% of the casualties were reportedly civilians. A joint OCHA Chatham House expert meeting in September of last year provided the first opportunity for focused discussions on the issue amongst member states and other organizations. A second meeting of states, convened by OCHA and Norway, will be held next month to identify existing good military policy and practice. OCHA aims to work with partners to mobilize multilateral action to curb the use of explosive weapons with wide area effect in populated areas through member state recognition of the humanitarian impact of the use of these weapons, and through a commitment to avoid or minimize such use in the future, including by building on existing good practice in this area, some of which we have heard earlier today. Some final thoughts on opportunities at the more operational level to mitigate the risks that I mentioned. Participants at the OCHA Chatham House meeting underlined the importance of civilian casualty tracking mechanisms as a means of understanding the impact of military operations on civilians and identifying the changes in military tactics required to reduce harm to civilians. This is generally undertaken by military forces themselves. Another tool is casualty counting, which is undertaken by various other actors, both UN and non-governmental. OCHA and the Oxford Research Group have looked at different ways in which the UN has undertaken casualty counting. I look forward to Hana's presentation later. I would also note this is an important part of the follow-up to the Secretary General's agenda on, which is the Rights Up Front Action Plan, an important part of which is improving the way the United Nations system works together to manage information on casualties. There is a positive practice on risk mitigation from other operations that can be relevant, in particular, the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan and the African Union mission to Somalia. While these operations are quite different from UN peace operations in terms of the use of force, both have needed to address reducing the risk of harm to civilians and have taken interesting approaches in doing so. These experiences can inform UN peacekeeping. Risk mitigation measures are a critical tool to support adherence to international humanitarian law obligations, but they can and should extend beyond this. It must also be stressed, and David mentioned this this morning, that threats to civilians cannot be addressed by military and security means alone. Strengthened state institutions, including national army, police, and judicial systems, as well as access to basic services, are essential for the protection of civilians over the longer term. The degree to which these different tracks can be synchronized as part of a holistic approach, that is, bringing together military, security, political, and governance dimensions, will be critical to success in the delivery of protection of civilians' mandates. There is an opportunity within multidimensional peacekeeping operations to encourage that these different elements are pursued simultaneously. While humanitarians see manifestly the benefit of a holistic approach, it's important to bear in mind that humanitarian action must remain impartial and cannot be used or instrumentalized to pursue political military objectives. Again, another challenge for us to work together closely in order to mitigate those risks. This brings me finally to the question of dialogue between humanitarian actors and mission actors. This dialogue is essential to mitigating risk, both to civilians and to humanitarian operations. Humanitarian actors in the field have a strong understanding of the threats to and vulnerabilities within the communities they serve, and the mechanisms these communities use to cope with those threats. Their insight can form part of both of risk assessments to forecast the potential impact of operation, but also of planning to minimize those risks. While the complexity on the ground and the demands of these new mandates require closer dialogue between humanitarians and mission actors, they can also, in some cases, call for greater distinction between the military and political roles of the mission on the one hand and the roles of humanitarian actors on the other. The relationship, or the nature of this relationship, will and must depend on the circumstances on the ground. Form must follow function. In South Sudan, humanitarian actors and UNMISS are working side by side to meet the humanitarian and security needs of IDPs that have taken refuge within UNMISS bases, but are maintaining a more visible distance in other areas, including in opposition areas. In the DRC, the Humanitarian Protection Cluster has worked with MONUSCO to prioritize its presence to protect civilians by developing a protection matrix that categorizes areas between must protect, should protect, and could protect. More recently, humanitarian actors have contributed to assessing and understanding risks to civilians in advance of the Force Intervention Brigade's operationalization. This dialogue is essential to assuring that both mission and humanitarian actors can effectively deliver on their different mandates. In this spirit, OCHA has led a mission last year to Mali, bringing together DPKO, OHCHR, UNHCR, UNICEF, and NGO partners to look at how the Protection Cluster and MINUSMA could work together effectively and appropriately. A number of recommendations were made in this context, reflecting both good practice that had emerged and recent policy developments. A similar mission to CAR is currently being discussed among UN actors. Finally, I'd say in conclusion that I'm very happy that IPI has brought together this panel to share these thoughts, and I'm looking forward to hearing from the colleagues. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks very much, Greg. Excellent summary of OCHA's perspective on some of these issues. We'll turn next to Hana Salama, who is the Senior Advocacy Officer of the Every Casualty Program at the Oxford Research Group. Hana has also worked for Amnesty International and for the Canadian federal government. Please, Hana.
Thank you. Thanks for that lovely introduction, and thanks to Greg, too, for your intervention. I'm going to focus on a very practical tool that we hope can narrow the gap between the protection norm and the implementation, and that is the role of casualty data and casualty recording to support protection mandates. Okay, so just before I begin giving you a background on what we do at the Oxford Research Group, I'd like to briefly define casualty recording so we're all on the same page about what I'm talking about here. So casualty recording is a process, it's a systematic and continuous process to document deaths, direct deaths and injuries from armed violence. This process aims to be comprehensive and record all casualties by all parties to the conflict. It records information such as the date of an incident, the location, the description of the violence, so the weapons used, the number of victims in an incident, perhaps even the identities of the victims, the demographic information, and information about perpetrators. So this is distinct from a practice which we've been talking about, which is also a very good practice in supporting protection mandates, which is civilian harm tracking, which is exclusively done by the warring parties themselves to gather and analyze data about their own operations and the impact of those operations on civilians, whether it's deaths, injuries, or infrastructure damage. So obviously both mechanisms are complementary and are necessary for the protection of civilians. So I mentioned, so the Oxford Research Group, what we do is that we have done research into the practice of casualty recording. We began by looking at 40 non-governmental organizations, local organizations who do this practice in a consistent way, that have done it in conflicts all over the world. And this is because the state was either party to the conflict or wasn't able to carry out this work. And then we continued our research looking at how this practice has been carried out by the UN, focusing specifically on the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan. So from this research, we've been working with practitioners, so at the UN and also with NGOs and states on what the principles for good casualty recording would be. So we're developing standards and guidance for the implementation of this practice. And finally, we're doing advocacy around the protection of civilians on this practice. And so far I can say that this practice has been seen as an emerging good practice for the protection of civilians. And over 17 states have recognized and mentioned the importance of this practice. And the Secretary General also in his latest report on the protection of civilians gave a recommendation that the UN should develop a common system to record casualties in the context of broader human rights monitoring. So back to the context of peacekeeping operations. We've heard about the gap, the kind of protection gap, and the many challenges, and a lot of the time, we spoke about political will. The specific kind of aspect of that gap that casualty recording could address is this gap on information, this lack of information even prior to protection, to the formulation of protection mandates. So Security Council members and the Secretariat sometimes have a lack of understanding on the specific nature of the threats to civilians. And by developing a casualty recording system which could intake information from either UN actors who are already on the field, NGO actors, or others, this kind of data, when systematically analyzed, can identify patterns of harm to the conflict, from the conflict, including what the weapons that are being used, what are the violent hotspots, who are the perceived targets, and who are the vulnerable demographic group. So this is something that we think could be developed prior to seeking approval of POC mandates in peacekeeping missions. And so now everyone's wondering, so how do we do this? Like I said, it could be efforts to record information remotely could be supported. One of the things that the Oxford Research Group has looked at recently was the amount of information coming out of Syria on civilian casualties and casualties in general. And so we did a report which analyzed the child casualties in Syria and looked at what were the patterns of harms to children in Syria, and found very useful information that could be useful to child protection actors, such as most children have died from explosive weapons and their use in populated areas. Some children have been even targeted by snipers, and just the different ways in which and contexts which children are being affected by the conflict. And like I said, this could be really useful for child protection actors. So that's kind of at the Secretariat level. We've looked at the mission level, and we've done a review of what kind of information is available for the UN, what kind of casualty recording happens. And we've seen that as a peacekeeping operation or as a multilateral operation, the UN could play a crucial role in recording casualties, as it could be viewed as an impartial actor, especially when the states are not capable or are parties to the conflict. So this kind of thing we've seen borne out by many examples of good practices at the UN. So for example, OCHA in the occupied Palestinian territories systematically documents deaths, injuries, and other forms of harm as part of their humanitarian program there. We've also seen the UN Mines Action Service, which records the deaths and injuries from landmines and UXO, and this kind of information feeds into their programming and their mines clearance activities and mine risk education. And finally, UNAMA and the Human Rights Unit in UNAMA, who systematically collects data on civilian casualties and uses that data in private and public advocacy with conflict parties to reduce civilian harm in the future. So what we've seen for UNAMA has been a couple of, or 5 factors, which we think contributed to the success or the relative success of that system, and we think that could be transplanted into other operations or other missions. So the first was the credibility of UNAMA's data. So UNAMA was a kind of trusted, that the data they produced was trusted by the different actors, and this was mainly due to the kind of robust methodology which they had documented and which was clearly available for everyone to see. This was also aided by their robust way of verifying incidents, so 3 independent sources. They had a clear advantage of having an established field presence. So UNAMA had many field offices in the provinces and had good connections to local actors like civil society organizations and even to ISAF and international actors, which enabled them to verify the incidents. Another kind of key factor is the use and the timely and effective use of the data. So once the incidents have been verified and they have perceived, a particular trend in terms of weapon use or other behavior of a conflict party that harms civilians, they went ahead and did timely advocacy with those conflict parties, and that helped them fulfill kind of the protection mandate which they had, and they and the activities that they conducted. And finally, we've seen that this information was not only, it was produced by the Human Rights Unit, but it was not only kept in the Human Rights Unit, so it was shared with relevant actors. It was even shared with victims' assistant groups who had requested verification of certain incidents or certain deaths to give reparations. So basically, we had, just to reiterate, two recommendations. And the first was that casualty recording should be undertaken as early as possible, perhaps even before there is a mission and before there is a peacekeeping mandate. Second, as well as the having casualty recorded implemented in the mandate itself. So having clear language which indicates that casualty recording could be implemented at a mission level. So we saw with the UNAMA mandate, it had a clear mandate to monitor and protect civilians. So this monitoring language is very important, and we think it could be developed to include casualty recording. And finally, at a mission level, we think that it was very useful to have one component be collecting this information systematically. It's important that that component also gives consideration to what other uses that this data could have, and share with the other parts of the mission. And this is, something which David mentioned before, and Greg has mentioned, part of the coordination, and that could be kind of a practical way to do this coordination by sharing this data. And finally, we think that, of course, information from harm tracking is really important, and there should be a mechanism to share that securely, and that any mechanism that does develop in a new mission should learn from the experience of UNAMA. I'll just conclude by saying that, of course, this, UNAMA was a quite a unique case, and we saw that there was a definite strong leadership in carrying out this work. And we think that, it's great to have good people lead on these issues, but if it's not institutionalized, then we won't see this being replicated in other missions, and we won't see the benefits. So leadership is important, but some sort of institutionalization will be very important. And I see a couple of ways to engage on this issue. So the Rights Upfront Action Plan now, which has also spoken about peacekeeping, and the IOAS report, which was mentioned earlier, which also gives a recommendation to peacekeeping missions to monitor their own action and monitor progress, which could include a reduction in civilian casualties. And that's all. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Hana. Very interesting on the various uses of casualty recording and some of the benefits that you've seen. Thanks for that presentation. Next, we have Robert Ayasse from NATO. Robert started his career in the Canadian government, where he worked also in the OSCE before moving to NATO. He's worked in the NATO headquarters, supporting operations in Bosnia and Kosovo, and then focusing on Afghanistan. Currently, he's the headquarters focal point for protection of civilians on the Afghanistan operations team. Robert, please.
Thank you very much. I'm the last speaker of this event. As such, I have one key objective. That objective is to keep you awake. So, as Ambassador Evans, my NATO colleague, mentioned this morning, ISAF has made enormous progress on civilian protection over the life of the mission. For being responsible, as he said, for over 40% of civilian casualties in 2006 to 7, ISAF ended 2013 causing less than 1%, despite a heavy operational tempo. We also heard that in 2009, ISAF moved towards a population-centric counterinsurgency mission. What I want to address is, how did we achieve that? My view is that this was accomplished by learning one important and fundamental truth, and by a number of new structures, practices, and policies. The truth is this, and it's been mentioned by a number of our colleagues this morning: training is the best protection we can provide to civilians, bar none. It has to start in pre-deployment. It has to be supplemented once personnel arrives in theater with theater-specific information. It has to be constantly updated by lessons learned, which are then added into the mix. In terms of policies, starting in the field level, I would suggest this new ethos of protection of civilians became institutionalized through binding counterinsurgency guidance and a series of COM-ISAF tactical directives. Now, I know that for many people in this room, airstrikes have always been a particular cause for concern. So let me use that as an example. In the last iteration of the tactical directives, in cases where there is any risk to civilians, the tactical directives now restrict the use of close air support to truly in extremis situations where there are no other alternatives to save the lives of ISAF or Afghan soldiers. Now, this ethos has also introduced two principles into ISAF's operational acquis, and it also speaks to the very powerful points that Captain Herblon made this morning. The first one is this: it's courageous restraint, whereby ISAF soldiers accept greater personal risk in exchange for safeguarding the lives of civilians. The underlying concept of this is that avoiding civilian casualties enhances the support of the local population. And so there's a balance to be struck between the short and long-term force protection. The second principle is what we call tactical patience, which means that even if there's a possibility to engage a fully legitimate and high-value target, if there is any possibility that civilians could be at risk, that soldier must instead be patient, wait for a future opportunity, and do not take that shot. When, despite our best efforts, an incident does nevertheless occur, we have a few key principles which guide our actions. The first is all claims of civilian casualties are treated as credible until they are proven otherwise. Second, always be first with the truth. Third, reach out to the affected community and amend harm. A second set of policy developments at the political level came in June 2010, when ISAF defense ministers endorsed a set of non-binding guidelines for payments in cases of combat-related civilian casualties or the destruction of their property. Now, the guidelines were developed through a lengthy process with ISAF nations and were co-written with a leading NGO who's present here today. Now, they are not formal policy because our nations have different interpretations of when payments should be made in such circumstances, and also the extent to which making such a payment might imply legal liability. For that reason, they are non-binding in nature, as the title of them suggests. Nevertheless, they were promulgated by former COM-ISAF General Petraeus, and they did significantly influence the policies of many individual nations. So while policy is important, it cannot stand without the right practices and the right structures to underpin it. ISAF therefore established a cell to track civilian casualties in the summer of 2008. In 2011, following a decision by the North Atlantic Council, this body was expanded, renamed the Civilian Casualties Mitigation Team, or the CCMT, and it was made the direct responsibility of the head of all ISAF operations. Now, being as we are in New York, I figure I can't go wrong with quoting a famous New Yorker. Former New York City Mayor Bloomberg used to say that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Now, the CCMT's principal role is to ensure the coherent documentation of civilian casualty incidents and to act as the overall ISAF focal point on all aspects of mitigating civilian harm. So it is meant to capture this data and measure the effectiveness of our efforts to protect civilians so that our commanders in the field can more effectively manage how we do that even better. Through its 4 working groups, the CCMT leads efforts ISAF-wide to engage with the local community of international organization and NGO actors, to develop enhanced mitigation measures on the ground, to capture and disseminate lessons learned and best practices, and to also influence the local population so that their interactions with ISAF are as safe as possible. An example would be, what is the best way to safely navigate a vehicle checkpoint? Things of that nature, very practically grounded. As you know, the Afghan National Security Forces have now been leading security efforts countrywide for almost a year. ISAF, therefore, is giving a very high priority to training the Afghan National Security Forces to avoid civilian casualties. ISAF is also encouraging the Afghan government to develop its own investigative and compensation policies and mechanisms. And this sort of ongoing training, advising, and assisting is going to be a major part of the work done by the post-2014 Resolute Support Mission. Now, because this panel is meant to be focusing on best practices and things of a practical nature, let me conclude with an informal list of key lessons learned. These are not agreed NATO policy. However, it represents the views of those of us who've been practitioners in this space for a number of years, and also incorporates ideas that we have gotten through our regular dialogue with the International Committee of the Red Cross, with various UN actors, and a whole range of NGOs. So here they are. Number one, plan for how the protection of civilians aspect of the mission's mandate will be successfully implemented. It has got to be a part of future operations plan from the very beginning. Number two, establish one single focal point responsible for the protection of civilians and all its aspects. It should have a clear mandate for collecting information, for dialogue, for outreach to local actors, and also outreach to other international community actors. Establishing a structure like the Civilian Casualties Mitigation Team can provide a vital focal point and a center of gravity for mission's protection of civilian efforts. Three, as I said, personnel training is the best protection we can offer civilians. Particularly when the mission involves counterinsurgency operations, personnel must be trained extensively on the POC and include pre-deployment training, theater-specific training, and familiarization, and you have to follow that up in theater. Four, accepting greater tactical risk can enhance your long-term force protection. Causing civilian casualties is enormously damaging to mission support, let's be honest, both within the operational area and also with our domestic constituencies and our contributing nations. Five, aim to always be first with the truth. This is very, very difficult because you have to strike a balance between the need to address an alleged incident as quickly as possible on the one hand, but waiting long enough to develop confidence in the narrative you're going to tell on the other. You are better off to take heat for a number of days as opposed to going forward and saying, absolutely, we had nothing to do with this incident, to only find out later that you did. Six, make every effort to influence local understanding of the safety precautions. Number seven, all credible reports of civilian harm incidents should be thoroughly and credibly assessed. And within that, a mechanism should be established to ensure that personnel with appropriate technical expertise are available to assess all credible reports of civilian harm incidents on very short notice. If it is an incident involving artillery strike, you'd best have someone who knows artillery well to be on that team. Or if it's close air support, you need those sort of expertise. Eight, proactive strategic communications are absolutely key. This should aim to compellingly demonstrate just how far the NATO-led mission is going to protect civilians, and also showcase acts committed when necessary by the opposition. And even more effective, engaging with the local authorities so that they are the ones routinely who are publicly condemning opposition actions with harmed civilians. Again, in the case of Afghanistan, over 85% of incidents last year were caused by the insurgency. It is much more effective if it's the Afghan government standing up and condemning those actions than it is if the person is international, be them military or be them civilians. Number 9, cases of civilian harm or damage to property should be handled in line with our agreed non-binding guidelines. And number 10, mainstream protection of civilians into the training that we will do of local forces, and make sure that institutional mentoring and key leader engagement is present to follow those lessons up. I will leave it there because I'm really hoping we will have some time left for dialogue, but thank you very much, and you all stayed awake. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Rob. And then congratulations. Success on that. I thought one point in particular that you said, even though it's a very different context, is applicable to UN peacekeeping, as we talked about earlier. And that was your point that at times an acceptance of greater tactical risk leads to more effective long-term force protection. which I think in the UN context brings us back to the previous discussion and the OIOS report that was pointed out, and perhaps that willingness to take greater tactical risk at times might then lead to better force protection in the future. But something we can talk about as well. I also want to thank our panelists for their presentations, very good. And I also want to thank you for not using any PowerPoint, which I think everyone should be congratulated anytime they don't do that. So we do have one more speaker who's we've invited to give a very brief remarks following the panel, and that's Marla Keenan, who's Managing Director and Director of Military Engagement for the Center for Civilians in Conflict. Do we have a microphone, or you can use the, yeah, please.
Well, thank you so much for inviting us to offer brief remarks. And I actually never write out my remarks, but I did today because 5 minutes is really difficult. I just want to start us out by bringing us back to kind of a 10,000-foot level to look at this. You know, when I think about protection as an umbrella. We have on one side of the umbrella humanitarian protection, and on another side of the umbrella, the protection that can come to civilians based on military operations. And when I think about the military operations side, which I'm going to focus on today, what I think about is the baseline that several people have talked about, and that is the baseline of IHL, the protection that IHL provides to civilians from military operations. On the opposite end of that spectrum, you have proactive protection that peacekeepers offer, where they're actually placing themselves between a perpetrator and a victim. And somewhere in the middle there, I see this sort of emerging area that we at the center refer to as civilian harm mitigation. And those are policies and practices on top of IHL that actually help operations to understand their impact on civilians, so that you can pull back, you can change tactical directives, you can do all of the things that will allow you to better protect the civilians from your own operations. So we work directly with warring parties basically to create policies and practices to do just that, to better protect civilians from military operations, civilian harm mitigation. This can take place over the life cycle of an entire conflict, and it can be before the conflict begins, during training and pre-deployment planning. It can be during the operations when you're creating mechanisms such as civilian casualty tracking cells, in order to understand the impact of your operations and to inform adjustments to the tactics that you're using. It can also be afterwards in the inculcation of the lessons, not just the learning of the lessons, but actually in the inculcation of the lessons and creation of standing policies, so that the next time a peacekeeper, a country, a military goes to conflict, that those policies are already there, so that we're not back at square one learning the lessons that we learned this time around. So now I've kind of given you the overarching look at it. I'm going to pull us back in and focus specifically on civilian harm tracking, analysis, and response, what we call civilian harm tracking for short. The goal of civilian harm tracking is to help a warring party understand its impact of operations on the civilian population that it's operating amongst. Basically to understand how civilians are being harmed, but also to advise policies and practices that can help armed actors to better avoid and respond to the harm that they're creating, whether that's by investigations, whether that's by making amends, as Rob was speaking about. So civilian harm tracking basically involves the systematic collection and analysis of information from the ground. That could be operational information on the military side, that could be recording of civilian casualties coming in from civil society, and with an eye toward using that information to actually inform changes in tactics and allowing commanders to make operational decisions. So this is an emerging concept, but there's actually several places that we're starting to see it. The first, of course, is Afghanistan, which you've already sort of spoken about. My colleague Sahar would be sad if I didn't mention this, but we just released this report that came out where we basically did a systematic study of what ISAF had done in order to create their tracking mechanism. We spoke to about 30 people all the way up and down the chain of command to civil society to try and understand how things happened, what exactly created the impetus to create the tracking cell. So I encourage all of you to take a look at that. I think they're there towards the back. But basically, in 2008, ISAF leadership established the Civilian Casualty Tracking Cell to document death and injury as a result of their combat operations. And the CCTC in Afghanistan was the first large-scale tracking mechanism that we're aware of. It was established because there was a recognition of the need to address allegations of ISAF-caused civilian casualties. The initial mechanism was modest, and it required very little planning and reallocation of resources, but as they moved on through the years and coming into 2011, they actually realized what a great tool this was, and they actually created the Civilian Casualty Mitigation Team, which was kind of like a beefed up version of the tracking cell that could actually also interface with civil society, and created that sort of coordination mechanism that we're talking about being so important, is an understanding between civil society, in this case UNAMA and AIHRC, in a way to sort of double check the civilian casualties that were being reported. The information from the cell was used to influence recommendations for tactical directives and to input into pre-deployment training. The reason why I believe it worked so well in Afghanistan and it was developed further was that there was a full understanding of the commanders of how important this was, and there was it was their intent to pass that information down and make it clear to the chain of all up and down the chain of command how important this was and why this information was needed and what was going to be done with it. The second place is AMISOM in Somalia. We're still sort of moving in that direction. They have an implementation plan, and they're currently working to hire their staff. This will be a bit of a more robust cell in that it will have tracking, analysis, and response all within the cell and centralized in one place, so that an incident of civilian harm can be tracked all the way from when it happens to when amends are made to the family. And then also any resulting changes to tactical directives or rules. We're hoping it will be up and running by late this summer, but I don't know. We'll see. But this mechanism was, as Walter mentioned, was actually followed through the indirect fire policy, where it was first mentioned that it would be helpful to understand the operations if there was some way to have information coming in and to kind of put that information in one place so that the people who could analyze it actually had it all in one place and they could analyze it. In Mali, there's interest on the ground in the mission to creating what they're referring to as a civilian harm mitigation mechanism. I think this is incredible, and this is something that we're actually pushing for all UN missions, particularly those that have a more robust mandate. It provides, I think, a peacekeeping mission, an additional level that on top of what it provides for traditional militaries, and I think that is having a robust capability to report back on protection of civilians to the Security Council. To me, that is absolutely incredibly important to have, and while there are other tools out there doing that, this is specifically focused on civilian harm and the risk to civilians, as Greg so clearly explained. So we're excited to see that. Another thing in Mali is that this was the first mission that was created with a position, with a civilian harm mitigation advisor position or a risk mitigation advisor position, which we're very interested in seeing come to fruition, and we're hoping that will happen soon. But one of the most important things I want to leave you with is that lessons learned are amazing, and so many people are doing all of this hard work to pull together all of these sort of soul-searching issues. It's only if we can capture those in standing policy, and only if we can make sure that the next time we're going to conflict or the next time we're doing a peacekeeping operation, that those policies are there and they're ready to be used, and the soldiers who need to use them understand how to use them and why they're important. That's another point to the mindset, that all of this work will have made sense. So thank you guys for your time. I hope that was short enough. And I encourage you all to pick up the case study if you have a minute.
Thanks, Marla. We're a bit behind, as you may have noticed, but I would like to give some time for question and answers. We'll just do one long round of questions and get back to the panelists for final remarks. So please raise your hand if you have a question for any of the panelists, and we have microphones that are traveling around and can grab you. I know there's been a lot of information, so you probably don't know where to start. But please, up in the back, I see General Kameret.
I have a quick one on the what Walter mentioned at the beginning, that in AMISOM there was not a protection of civilian mentioning in the mandate. Reminds me a bit on 2008 when there was a crisis again in the North Kivus, in Sake and Goma, and MONUSCO had a protection of civilian mandate and also a mandate to support the FARDC. That led immediately to the excuse for non-action of saying the mandate and the rules of engagement are vague. And that resulted that the Security Council said it is a priority to protect civilians under imminent threat. Now, I like to argue differently because I think that if you look in every mission when there is fighting, where does the local population run to? They all run to the nearest United Nations compound. What do they expect? They expect protection. So as a commander in the field, if you like it or not, you have to provide that protection. So in my view, you should also look, even if it is not in your mandate, you should look at the intent of the Council's mandate and not only the words. And if you understand the reason why you're there, then it is also easier for a commander on the ground to take action.
Okay. More of a comment. Right here in the front, please.
Hi, I'm Catherine Dumay-Harper. I'm a former representative of Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders to the UN. I'm not speaking on behalf of MSF, but my own remarks from my own experience. First of all, I've been very frustrated this morning because I didn't see one representative from a real, impartial, independent humanitarian organization. I think that's missing here when you talk about protection of civilians in conflict areas. And I'm glad that the last speaker mentioned the IHL because everything is based protection of the civilian conflict area in the international humanitarian law. Obviously, the UN agencies and OCHA are not independent. They are not impartial. They are political. They are seen and they are from a UN organization with a political organ. And they are also tied to the political issues of the UN, including the resolution of the Security Council. Years ago, during the conflict in Angola, I have this really great and very hot discussion with Sergio de Mello, who at the time was the OCHA director. And why they didn't, they could not, for example, go to Angola. They will go only to distribute humanitarian aid to the government-controlled areas. Because of the Security Council resolution, they didn't have the permission to have contact with UNITA. And I tell you, Sergio was very frustrated with the situation. He explained to me they were trying to get contact in Europe with some of the UNITA representatives, but basically the member states, some of them were saying, no, you cannot. It's the same situation today in Syria. As we know, the UN is not able to efficiently distribute humanitarian in some conflict area of Syria, and we can say other countries. I'm not going to make any comments on the ISAF because that would be too long for me to do so. I don't think Afghanistan is very safe for humanitarian workers, and especially for them. We're not talking about our protection, we're talking about civilian protection. But because of this military intervention, we pretend to do humanitarian work, there's a lot of confusion in the field who is doing what. And that has a big impact on the security of the local and international humanitarian people who work there. So, my last comments is I want to, the previous comments, yes, the UN Security Council resolution has to be very strong in their mandate, otherwise no use. Don't forget that when a population is expecting the blue helmet, they expect some protection. And back to Kisangani, back to now in the conflict now, they don't get them necessarily with the UN peacekeeping mission. And most of the time they are not UN peacekeeping, but peacemaking mission. Thank you.
Okay, well, our panelists are getting off easy so far. No questions. Yeah, right here in the front.
Hello, thank you very much. I do have a question. I'm Barbara Carter-Linston from the Austrian mission to NATO. First, thank you so much for very interesting presentations this morning. It was together with Norway that Austria is leading the Tiger team on the protection of civilians at NATO. And as was said this morning, we are currently looking into the lessons learned process and also the question of international cooperation. We heard that this morning that good progress has been made in ISAF and that similar procedures on civilian casualty tracking is also undertaken through the AU. So my question would be how good the cooperation is already between the different organizations working on this, and whether you see room for enhancing this process of learning from each other even more. Thank you.
Thanks. I think we have one final question all the way in the back. Here's a question.
Good afternoon, Jérémy Labbé from the International Peace Institute. Well, actually, that I will make the task of the panelists easy because my question was exactly along the lines of the previous question. I was really interested to hear about are there existing platforms for sharing of experience between NATO, between AU, and between other regional organizations that can potentially take a greater role in, well, sometimes some peace enforcement processes aimed at protecting civilians eventually. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll go back to our panels for some brief closing remarks and answer the questions. Probably do the same as the last panel where you have 1 minute each, if you can keep to that. We'll go in reverse order, maybe starting with Robert, please.
Sure, no, thanks for that question. It's a very good one. Stephen Evans mentioned this morning that our current focus is on capturing all these lessons learned and institutionalizing them. Now, this process is, of course, going to be very useful for our own internal use and our own internal consumption. But when the tasking was crafted, we were very careful to do two things. Number one, to make it very clear to the entities that will do this work that we fully expect that they are going to seek the views from our key international organization partners, for example, the UN, the ICRC, and the like. And number two, we also made it clear that the similar approach should be taken with key NGO partners with whom we have worked, because we believe that all of those views are fundamental to our own overall understanding. That's the first part. The second part is, once these lessons learned come, the next step, the critical step, is to then take all of that and turn that into the sort of products that will endure and guide NATO actions over the next, say, 10, 15 years. I'm talking about developing standard operating procedures, doctrinal products. You could have an operations plan annex that says, this is what a civilian casualty mitigation team should look like. This is what it should do. If you're having an operation of this nature, you take that off the shelf, you add it into your operational planning, and you avoid this learning curve that we had in ISAF. That's really the key. Now, the point that you've raised, how does this get shared? We have also put in the tasking that when all these doctrinal products and the like are developed, there needs to be releasable versions of those so that we can share all of that as widely as possible amongst all the allies, amongst all our operational partners, but also with the UN, with the AU, with the EU, with the IO and NGO community, with any actor that thinks our experience might somehow inform the way they might wish to act, behave, or create policy for.
Thanks. Hannah, please.
I think in terms of just touching on what you spoke on, in terms of what the who the real threats are in the conflict, and it's great that the warring parties are or international forces are tracking their own casualties, but they are not the ones causing most of the casualties. So it's important to have an understanding of the deaths and injuries and other harm to civilians from other parties of the conflict. And that's where I think that a kind of holistic casualty recording mechanism can come in. So it's the ways or other platforms that people have mentioned have to start by looking contextually at the mission and looking at which components would benefit from this information, because protection is part of what a peacekeeping mission does, but it's not the only part. And the other areas in which they work, like facilitating humanitarian assistance and engaging with national and international accountability measures, could also be benefited from this type of data. And so I would encourage, a mission-level discussion of who would have the most expertise in conducting this kind of mechanism, how the information will be shared, and what will be the coordination mechanism. Okay, thanks.
Thanks. Greg, please.
Thank you. Well, I thank Madame Dume Harper for her comment, and I think it puts in very stark relief the kind of challenges that we face, particularly with regard to the question of engagement with non-state armed groups. And she mentioned the example of Angola some time ago. I mean, humanitarian actors must be able to engage with non-state armed groups in conflict, both so as to access populations with humanitarian assistance that are under their effective control. And if you think about some of the places of the most acute humanitarian need in the world now, they are in fact places that are under the effective control of non-state armed groups. And also so as to enhance their understanding of and respect for international humanitarian law. But in the environments where the United Nations is mandated, or peacekeeping operations are mandated, with a very robust offensive mandate, and the humanitarian actors are closely associated with that renders that incredibly difficult. How can you engage with a non-state armed group when you are publicly identified with another arm of the organization that is in conflict with that armed group? It makes it acutely difficult. I am not saying that the mitigating measures that can be put in place to maintain a distinct identity for humanitarian actors within integration arrangements are perfect. They are not. We will continue to face these challenges, but it's precisely in those environments where we need to work together and organize as a community, within the humanitarian community, to insist upon the importance in those environments of those measures, of a distinct identity, of a distinct communication stream, of the inappropriateness of co-location, for example, in certain circumstances. And so this does not completely solve the fundamental problem, but I think we can do much better than we have done in working together to build those kinds of mitigating measures. I'd also note that certainly in the last 10 or 15 years of the Security Council's practice, it has not been the Council mandating or humanitarian actors to prioritize this or that community. In fact, the Security Council has, developed a practice of referring to the humanitarian principles of impartiality, neutrality, and independence. But it is in the restrictions that are sometimes imposed either by donor states, particularly with regard to counterterrorism measures, which can criminalize contact with certain non-state armed groups and have had a significant effect on a range of humanitarian actors, NGOs and United Nations differently, but still an important impact on both, and by host states, with whose consent international humanitarian actors are present, who impose restrictions on the engagement with non-state armed groups on using counterterrorism or other rationale. These measures need to be collectively considered and challenged insofar as they prevent humanitarian actors from providing assistance purely according to need to those communities that are suffering the most because they are in areas controlled by non-state armed groups that are in political opposition to either host states or donor states. This is a real problem we need to work together to overcome. Thank you.
Walter, final thoughts, please.
Thank you. Well, that makes it easy. That only leaves General Kamer's point. But I think it's an important point, and that's why it's worth reflecting on a bit further. just because it's not in the mandate, does that mean that you don't have to do it or that you can get away with not doing it? That's precisely the organizational learning that we had to do. We had it, well, we didn't have it in a mandate, then we had it in a mandate, then we didn't have it in a mandate. So one of the first questions that we had to ask ourselves was, well, why? Why does it pop up sometimes? Why doesn't it pop up at other times? And through a process of organizational learning, we realized that there are inherent obligations, and that whether you use very explicit language or very implicit language, there are basic things that we can do and that we should do and that we must do in the conduct of our operations. And then we had to map out what that was. But it's also organizational learning for the mission leadership and for the commanders and right down to the very tactical level in the operation, is to say, is the mandate there to tell you what to do, or is the mandate there to help you to understand and interpret your environment? And we place the emphasis very much on the second one. The mandate is not the how-to, it's not the do and don't. It's really this is the situation, this is what you're empowered to do, these are the options at your disposal, and now insert everything else into the missing spaces and go and implement your mandate. But you have to provide the right level of guidance, otherwise people will feel either too empowered and will run rampant with it, or they'll feel completely disempowered and won't want to act when they can and when they should. And that's a process of organizational learning that is top to bottom and that I think we still need to invest in further.
Thank you, Walter. Once again, I'd like to thank Norway and Austria for partnering with IPI in this event. I think it's been incredibly informative. You'll see a brief meeting summary come out in the next week or two, and I'd like to thank the panelists on the panel with me today, and thanks for coming as well. Have a good day.